Okay, we're going to give everybody a minute or two to funnel in here as Zoom works through the massive queue of people. But we have, quite a good number of people that have signed up for this very topical, very important webinar. So we'll give it another minute and then we'll let everybody. We'll get started. We'll start the chat. One more minute, Ben, and then we'll get cooking.
Should we talk politics while we're waiting? You're Canadian,
politics. Right? We can talk politics. We can talk about the massive liquidation in the crypto market, the liquidity issue that is happening in the crypto market, which will likely set crypto back 5 years. But that's another webinar topic unto itself, which is whether you believe in the blockchain or not. The lack of regulation and the liquidity hit that these shops are going to take is just going to be nasty. Okay, let's get started here. So thanks everybody for joining the next installment or the latest installment of the Reklaim webinar. We try to do this one time per month and talk to various different topics that are influencing or impacting the industry. One topic that is pervasive, and we could probably do a webinar on every single month, is this notion of privacy. So for this month's installment, we have Ben Isaacson, who I will let him introduce himself in a second, but is definitely an expert in the space. I think knowing Ben for a while now, I think what I've always often found with Ben is that he definitely has an opinion. It's a rational, unemotional opinion, and it's pretty clear. So I thought it'd be worthwhile for everybody here to hear us debate some of the topics and misconceptions. So Ben, why don't you introduce yourself to the crew here, tell them how amazing you are and kind of what you're doing, where you're working, and then we can frame up the conversation.
Thanks. As Neil mentioned, I'm Ben Isaacson. My practice is called In-House Privacy. It's a law firm, but I also work as a privacy consultant with Lucid Privacy and take on a few other hats out there as well. I've been in the space since 1996. I co-founded the first interactive marketing trade association and then spent 10 years at Experian doing global digital privacy for them and all their different divisions and subsidiaries around the world. And did a startup and have been in my own practice for about 6 years now. So happy to talk about anything related to privacy, marketing, blockchain, if you want to go there too.
Yeah. So I think, one of the genesis of this conversation kind of came, I think, after being at Adweek, quite candidly. And I think there was a few themes around Adweek that kind of irked me a little bit. One was, there's a lot of smart people in this industry. And I think what was concerning for me was the lack of consensus as it relates to kind of pending changes as it relates to privacy legislation and the impact on the industry. It would be almost better if there was consensus and that consensus was wrong, but there was no consensus. And it was really hard to get some momentum from different individuals that I spoke to about how they are addressing some of these changes. And we can talk to state level legislation, federal legislation, European legislation, but let's maybe start with kind of the most obvious one, is this notion of CCPA and the amendment towards CPRA. And I think just for everybody, can we give a little bit of a summary here on what is CCPA? What is this iteration on CPRA? When is it coming into effect? And I think that's just going to take us through sort of some of the myths and misconceptions that I feel that the industry is missing. So maybe let's do a level set on that state privacy legislation, and then we can iterate from there.
Yeah, it's a great place to start because I do a lot of contract negotiations and DPA red lines, and obviously between now and the end of the year, we're going to see a mountain of these kind of updated agreements where there's a notion that the CPRA is a new law that preempts or on top of the CCPA when it's actually just the CCPA and an amendment really to the CCPA. So when you're looking at whether or not to change an agreement or, again, how you approach this, you really should approach it like the CCPA is the law. The CPPA is the new regulator for the California law for the CCPA. And the CPRA, again, is just changes that we need to put in place. So, again, some of those most of those changes do obviously come into effect January 1st. It doesn't, just because the CPPA, the enforcement agency, isn't going to start enforcing until July at maybe the earliest of 2023, doesn't mean the law doesn't come into effect January 1st. It just means the regulations that they're putting forth, that require some clarity, might not actually come into effect until July. And so there's kind of this grace period, where you're looking at not, if you don't know how to comply with the law, like, well, we're not going to really enforce it at that point. But again, like everybody should be looking at January 1st as again, update refresh to the CCPA, or if you're not already in compliance with CCPA, now is the time to really look harder at it to get up to date.
Yeah, so I think the big one, and I know we had talked about this sort of in previous conversations, is that I've seen this myself, is that there tends to be language kind of being presented to vendors and other providers where, are you compliant with CPRA? And I think the first takeaway or the first myth is that it's not about being compliant with CPRA, it's about being compliant with CCPA and its amendments, which by default means you are compliant by CPRA. So anybody that's writing a contract and sort of putting in language around CPRA is missing kind of the forest for the trees, and that what you should be focused on is making sure that you're compliant with CCPA. Is that a fair kind of assessment?
Yeah, I mean, compliance with all laws, again, you don't need to even specify CCPA, but obviously everybody does for whatever reason. They just choose to specify CCPA. But again, all laws is all laws. The question is really around, again, and the law includes the amendments, right? That's crystal clear. Like if the legislature, which still has some authority to pass and exempt, certain categories of use, they can still go down their path. The confusion is around the regulations. And this is, the whole industry, the whole world is confused right now around the CPPA's draft regulations, which again, just was updated Friday, the most latest iteration. They've updated 3 times in the last 3 months. So we're in a place where, we had expected these regulations to be finalized, certainly by now, but unlikely to be finalized even by the end of the year. And to say in a contract, you need to comply with these regulations today or January 1st even, is sort of an impossible task because all we have is a draft. So there's a little bit of, maybe legalese and wiggle room, around, well, these regulations, will come into effect probably by July. So of course we'll comply by July, but, it's sort of a negotiation right now, whether you put that in an agreement or not.
Okay. So I want to talk sort of like, just sort of stay like laser focused on this, on CCPA, because I'm not sure everybody kind of even understands, okay, great, there's this new privacy legislation. What does it mean? So this notion of things like right to opt out, right to know, rights of minors, right to data portability. Can we frame up sort of what these big ones are and kind of what they mean? Because I also want to speak to the new CPRA rights that kind of came in, such as right to correction, right to know about automated decision making, right to limit the use of sensitive personal information. There's a lot here that I just want to make sure that we sort of address. So maybe can we start with sort of the base level of what CCPA started with, and then where we've now ended up with sort of some of these new amendments to CPRA, just so that everybody's on the same page?
Yeah, and we could spend the whole time on this topic, and I want to kind of narrow it to the most material, I think, issues here. And so the biggest one, I think, again, maybe I'm biased, is the CPRA expansion the for the sale and share of personal information. And this new category of share is really, in my opinion, what drove the authors of the CCPA, which again was a private organization who pushed a referendum in California for the people of California to adopt verbatim the CPRA changes to the CCPA. This was not introduced by the legislature like the CCPA was kind of at the last minute compromised so that the legislature introduced, again, a very close to verbatim law that this organization had drafted, and then created the ability for the legislature to make some changes to that law. Like that's the basis of the CCPA, which is not the basis for the CPRA changes. So these changes were again introduced by a private organization through a referendum process. The legislature had nothing to do with it. The legislature cannot amend these changes. And one of these big changes is to expand the scope of sale, as we had traditionally called it under CCPA, to include the sharing of data under these new CPRA changes to close what was perceived as a loophole primarily in the ad tech industry. And ad tech being, again, a broad category, very specifically defined as cross-contextual behavioral ads, which the industry has done a pretty pathetic job of, I think, defining, because you've got like the network advertising initiative that now defines it more broadly as tailored advertising, and the Digital Advertising Alliance, which is, still interest-based advertising or other, again, terminology that's been used in the past, or behavioral advertising. Cross-contextual behavioral is a new term of art. So we're now like kind of messy in terms of self-regulation, industry guidelines, what really is cross-contextual behavioral ads. And ultimately that is what the regulations are trying to finalize right now. So we actually don't have a great answer, even on this call, like on November 9th, going into January, which is less than 60 days away, is the full scope of companies and data processing that could be considered cross-contextual behavioral ads. And there's a number of points in the regulations that are extremely confusing about even just the combination of data. If you were a service provider and you're somehow involved in like even analytics potentially, or attribution, could be even fraud potentially, and you're combining data from different sources, that was related to cross-contextual behavioral ads, are all of a sudden, can you still be a service provider? And this is like the most important point, is that under the law and these regulations that are proposed, if your company is engaged in cross-contextual behavioral ads, you cannot, under any circumstances, be a service provider. And this is the loophole that, again, the whole ad tech industry kind of relied on to say, hey, all we're doing here is helping an advertiser with their data on another media property to make sure they're advertising to relevant audiences. And we're just a middleman, or intermediary is the proper term. That intermediary role now requires the advertiser to disclose that do not sell or share my personal information link on their homepage and provide an opt-out. Again,
Okay,
no matter what the contract terms say, that must happen now in 2023.
Okay, there's a lot here.
Yeah.
There's a lot here. So let's stay on the service provider piece, because this is, to me, this is one of the big ones that I think people have kind of used as a way to obfuscate their sort of, let's say, liability or exposure, where they're like, oh, I'm a service provider, therefore, I'm out. And I think what we're saying here is that's going to be increasingly difficult for people to justify. And the natural place that I go to is the agency. So the agencies who are handling all kinds of data on behalf of brands have typically presented themselves as, sort of as service providers. To me, this is a big one, because the agency can now no longer consider themselves a service provider. And just that in itself, I think changes the narrative. So what's what does that mean for an agency who's typically never been kind of classified, who's always classified as a service provider, and like how do they adjust to that?
Yeah, it's a really great question because it requires parsing every particular processing activity that the agency is engaged in. So it's not to say, again, agencies can be service providers and they really should be service providers. But the work that they've historically done needs to be analyzed, and there may actually need to be kind of a multifaceted contract that says this work you do over here, that's a service provider activity. This work you do over there might be a third party activity. And you have to question as a business, do I still want to work with this agency to do that work? Or do I want to bundle that maybe with a different company that, maybe already has robust opt-out tools and whatnot? But it really requires that close analysis. And for the agency, they need to decide, do I really want to be in that business of that third-party service?
Well, that's sort of where I was going. So let's assume that all agencies have a variety of these relationships and a variety of these processes. Fair to say that kind of heading into this new iteration of privacy, that there needs to first and foremost be an examination of those processes and partners that we're working with, which takes time and effort. And when they do that, I think it would be rich to suggest that all those deals have to get repapered or at least re-examined. And if you're going to repaper or re-examine, what's the likelihood that all of those deals get repapered and re-examined and a subset of those deals just don't get cut?
Yeah, I mean, that's really important. I mean, so I work with an agency, and we just had this conversation a few weeks ago where there are, again, a small piece of their business crosses that line under CPRA. And they just said, we're just going to not do that. We're, January 1st, we're just going to cut that off. So that we honestly don't have to repaper because of their existing service provider under the old CCPA, and they could just get rid of that piece of it. And again, it was a relatively trivial as far as technology piece of it goes, where the services will continue as normal, just without that piece. They can get away with not having to repaper. But for everybody else, if you're doing lookalike modeling and you're procuring third-party data on their behalf, and you're doing all the stuff that makes you a really, data-centric agency, that's going to be really hard to do without repapering.
But is it the different? I mean, again, I'm trying to be a little provocative here, but is not the differentiation amongst that model that it's not about the media, it's about kind of the data? And like when I sort of examine kind of the various different agencies across the ecosystem, there's a lot of agencies that own data companies, big ones, whether that's through acquisition, or others who pride themselves on how it's their use of the data, which is the differentiation, and that, the media is almost kind of like the exhaust of sort of the intelligence that they're providing. Intuitively, it seems like this creates challenges for the sort of the positioning around that, potentially.
I don't know. I mean, I guess it goes both ways. I think, again, in the media space, there's a diversity of media now that wasn't existing before. Walmart has a DSP now, right? So like Amazon has a DSP. Like, I mean, again, like there's the types of media buying that's happening is getting more and more specialized, especially with all these kind of the walled gardens, and we can talk more about that issue too. Apple ads, like, so I think there's a strong role for media buying as a secret sauce specialty that requires some deep knowledge and due diligence into those new ecosystems. I mean, Netflix, whatever, like there's all these new retail media, like crazy stuff going on. So that I think is perfectly clean and clear, can still be a service provider activity. This other category of being a data centric agency is in traditional media agencies kind of delving into that over the last 5 years and building out. You used to have DMPs, now they've got clean rooms, now they've got again, every third party data marketplace solution in their system. They're going to have to kind of parse that out and say, okay, well, if we're going to keep doing this, we need to do it in a way that is very narrowly defined with written instructions and transparency. So if you have, like, again, a lookalike model data marketplace where you can go pull in demographics from like 100 different sources, But traditionally the brand never knew where that data came from, right? Like that was the agency doing that. Now they can't do that without being a third party. And it's sort of they're not quite a data broker, but they're sort of in the same category at that point. And the way to get around that is to build in what looks more like a very transparent data marketplace where they say, oh, I'm going to go buy data from this company to use for this model, and I'm going to do an insertion order or licensing agreement, and it just gets passed through. So the agencies can still be an intermediary. They just can't do the work without very clear written instructions that specify exactly what the client really wants to do. And they're just the pass through, right? So it's going to be really hard for them, but and it's a lot more paper, but it's going to be required.
What everybody wants is like, I mean, that the process with the agencies is slow. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody who's got contracts with agencies is sort of cringing a little bit, thinking that they've got to potentially go through another arduous sort of paper cycle. Net,
Yeah.
I definitely, there's a lot of topics here. Net, it's not status quo is basically what you're saying. And that if you are an agency, you need to be acknowledging sort of these changes that are happening in privacy and how they are impacting the relationships that you have, specifically as it relates to data and the positioning that you have in the market. Is that fair?
Yeah, fair. And I do want to bring up that second material issue though about CPRA and really the other state laws, which is sensitive data.
Hey, I was just going there. Nice,
Okay.
nice segue. Nice one. So yeah, the notion of like the introduction of sensitive personal information clause is like, let's define that, because the things that are deemed to be sensitive, again, I'm not sure everybody understands what is under that. Data on race and ethnicity, religious beliefs, political and philosophical convictions, speaking about elections, data on sex life or sexual orientation, genetic or biometric data, health data, geolocation data, social security number, and a few others, I believe. So like those are obviously the big ones. And again, I've been in this industry a long time. I go down that list of health data. Okay, that's an entire subsection of this industry that is transacting. Geolocation data, that's obviously, you know, top of mind for a lot of people. I want to talk to that one sort of specifically as well. We just had everybody kind of doing political advertising over the last 2 weeks. So talk to me a little bit about, you know, this definition of sensitive personal information and kind of what you can and cannot do in this new world of CCPA.
Yeah, let me segue that a little bit from what we just talked about with the agency, because I think this is really difficult, is that you have an agency that's historically procured third-party data on your behalf to build a lookalike model or just build an audience targeting solution for you. And that includes things like ethnicity or maybe race, you know, again, probably not religion or sex life, maybe sex life if you're LGBTQ, like maybe if you're really trying to be, again, like a much more open and friendly brand and you want to target an LGBTQ audience, right? The new requirement for the agency, again, to just wash their hands of it and be like, no, we're not doing this without transparency to you, the brand. The brand is going to license this data now directly. The agency is now just an intermediary. And now the brand has to say on their website that they license sexual preference data in order to do audience targeting. And they need to have a link on their homepage that says, you know, limit the use of sensitive personal information for California. And that's just California, right? For Virginia and other states, you have to actually get opt-in for the use of that data. So they need to kind of flow through those terms in their licensing agreement with the company that's licensing that LGBTQ, whatever, that sensitive data, to say you got opt-in for that data, which again is a very open question. Did they really get opt-in from Virginia residents for that data? Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. Maybe they get indemnified, fine, but that doesn't mean it's actually compliant.
Can you clarify one thing for me here, Ben? So if I am the brand and I'm using geolocation data as well as race and ethnicity data, how do I, assuming that I have to have a link on my website saying that I am sourcing these things, do I have to literally itemize these things? Or
Yeah.
so I have to have basically call it a pop-up or a link to say, I am capturing data on race, ethnicity, and geolocation data to target you. Yes or yes or no.
Well, no, I mean, that's up to the brand, the company to define how they apply that. Um, my understanding, again, all they really need is that link that's similar to the do not sell or share. They need the link to limit my sensitive personal information. That could just go to some web form, right? And they just give you an email address and you just, add it to your suppression list. So you don't need to say we're using it, at least at the point of that suppression collection. Now you do have to, I think, disclose it at the point of your privacy notice, right? And have that as one of the categories of sensitive information that you're collecting, buried somewhere in your 40-page privacy policy. But at the point of suppression, I don't believe you're required to make that notice. Oh, we are using your information for geolocation or race or ethnicity or whatever it is we're using it for. Because that might change day to day, right? Like you don't necessarily know when, and so companies who are engaged in that broad audience targeting or licensing of data, they're just going to throw like the 10 categories maybe or whatever in their privacy notice and just say, oh yeah, we might collect this information in a given year or use it.
Okay, so net is you've got to have that flag on your site. How you kind of itemize it is sort of at the discretion of the individual brand, which I think kind of brings us to the next question, which is sort of everybody has been sort of victimized by like kind of getting punched in the face with cookie notifications. And I think like what this discussion sort of speaks to is that we're kind of getting that wrong, right? Where the content management systems are sort of are going around to publishers and saying, oh, you need to get this opt-in on a cookie notification. As far as I know, there is no legislation that requires us to have a cookie notification. So I guess the first question is who's buying a cookie notification system? That's my first question. And then secondly, aren't we sort of missing the bigger issue, which is you're fixating on a cookie notification when in fact you should be fixating on a do not sell notification, because if you do the cookie notification and not do the do not sell, you're going to have some possible challenges with the AG or others in the future. Is that a roundabout way of summarizing that?
Yeah, I think, like I'm a big fan of CMPs as an industry because I think from a privacy by design perspective, like we've been advocating for this for forever. And just to give you a little bit of my background, like I worked in the email marketing industry for many years, as a privacy officer for a large, one of the largest global email service providers, and building in these kind of preference tools for email going back to the late 90s has been just an amazing evolution. That I think the CMPs kind of take to the next level. That said, to your point, that the law doesn't say, at least in the U.S., that you need to get consent for cookies anywhere. So it's been kind of it's been puzzling for me. Like why is every website collecting consent for cookies when there was no requirement to do so? And again, if you look at the language of the CCPA, there's nothing about cookie consent, and very specifically, the do not sell requirement is in the link from your footer of your web page, your homepage, right? It's not in a banner. In fact, if you're just doing the banner and not doing the footer link, you're actually not compliant, even if it says do not sell my personal information in the banner. So like there's all these companies that are just getting it wrong. And again, I can maybe place blame with the CMPs for not doing the right education process around this. But and there's nothing in the new laws that say that either. There's nothing in CPRA, there's nothing in Virginia or any of these other state laws that say you must get consent for cookies per se. It just says, again, you have targeted advertising, which is again a broad category, and really what we're looking at is still an opt-out regime, not an opt-in regime, unless again you're using sensitive data, which does require opt-in.
So takeaway on this one is we've got it asked backwards, and that we shouldn't be fixating on cookie consent. We should be focusing on do not sell. And that if there's a takeaway from the website, from this webinar, it's that, what's the strategy for ensuring that you have kind of the do not sell strategy figured out, and how does that work in conjunction with kind of the cookie?
I mean, again, consent, opt out or do not sell is still based on the notion of informed consent. And again, going back to email marketing, like this was and is really still the standard practice. So when you present the information, we want to use your information for this purpose. Here's how you opt out. And again, the wording of that to say do not sell it's rather unfortunate, but you need that language somewhere again in your footer. But it doesn't mean that you can't build out a robust preference center that is sticky, that's included in all of the information that you collect for CRM purposes or mobile app purposes or whatever, and just makes that persistent and available and delineated, right? So this is targeted ads, maybe this is sensitive information, this is mobile, geolocation, like whatever it is, like you give those choices, wherever the touch points are for their account and reg data.
Okay, cool. Let's keep moving here. Two things, and they're kind of part of the same topic, is where I think that there's also some confusion is this notion around sort of enforcement and the various different bodies of enforcement. So you made reference to the CPPA. I'm not sure necessarily everybody even knows what that is. And they might confuse that with the AG. And what is the relationship? And like, we're back to California here, but what is the relationship between Rob Bonta, the AG of California, and
AG elect?
AG elect, excuse me, yes. And I think where I want to go with this after is let's define like who's responsible for what, who's enforcing what. And if I'm on the other side of this webinar, should I be like taking the lead from the AG or should I be taking the lead from CCPA? And where this sort of manifests is in Sephora, right? So this lawsuit with Sephora, which I think is kind of a shot across the bow for really any Fortune 500 brand, to be like, this is the beginning of kind of more. Like, let's just define like the relationship between the AG and CPPA, and then let's talk a little bit about kind of where Sephora got it wrong and why.
Well, I mean, it's hard to speak to the Sephora mindset or whatever, but I guess the confusing part, right, is that the AG is still going down their same path, regardless of what the CPPA is doing with their regulations. This has been a little bit of, especially I think with Sephora decision, like a little confusing around a few different points, but the one most obvious one is around this opt-out preference signal issue, or global privacy control, as it was called. And so, under the CPRA changes was the introduction of this California Privacy Protection Agency, which for all intents and purposes is a mini FTC for the state of California. In fact, they were just, I don't know what the term of art is, but granted entry into the global privacy regulator ecosystem at this European conference, a couple weeks ago. So they're now like part of the, global regulator, effort. So they are their own agency, independent of the AG. AG can still go on and enforce CCPA the same way they have, for the last couple of years. The only enforcement action that's, I think, on paper is this consent decree with Sephora. It's not a decision that is a fine that was that's a precedent that we can use for true compliance guidance, because it is a consent decree. Sephora didn't admit wrongdoing, but yet there's a whole lot of really interesting things that came out of that consent decree that we're now looking at as the opinion of the Attorney General. That is unclear how it gets applied to everybody. The biggest being this notion that Sephora didn't honor these browser-based global privacy control signals that they should have honored under what the AG is interpreting the CCPA to say. And this is just an interpretation. The CCPA, as originally written, did not say you must honor global privacy control. It talked about the category of global privacy controls. And again, it's room for interpretation whether it applied to the previous CCPA or again the new CPRA version, which it will apply to. I think we're all in consensus that at some point in 2023, companies are going to have to honor this global privacy control, really opt-out preference signal. It's just a question of how that signal gets created and how it gets communicated to the website or company, because it's beyond web. and really what that communication with the end user is, because that's been extremely vague and confusing. But I think the point being, the AG may have their own interpretation of what that should look like that might differentiate from the CPPAs, at least until these regulations are really put to bed, which could be many months from now.
Yeah, and I think that makes it confusing for everybody because, not dissimilar to the narrative that you had where when we were talking about the contract, say, oh, you need to be compliant with CCPA. Well, the floor is literally moving underneath you. So even if you're trying your best to be compliant, how do you become compliant when the floor is moving? This further complicates it, in my opinion, because you have now two bodies with not necessarily the same agenda. You have an AG and then you have CPPA. Trying to figure out how you can accommodate one, the other, or both is tricky. And just again, for everybody who might not be familiar with Sephora, a quick summary on Sephora. Sephora, this is just verbatim, Sephora failed to disclose to consumers that it was selling their personal information, that it failed to process user requests to opt out of sale via user-enabled global privacy controls in violation of the CCPA, and that it did not cure these violations within the 30-day period currently allowed by the CCPA. So, I think, is that, did I miss anything there, Ben? Or is that pretty much
Well,
it?
there's a lot more to the consent decree, but that's kind of what we're talking about right now. And I guess for clarity, I would actually encourage everyone listening or who listens in the future, go to Sephora's website now and look what they've done, because it seems to set the new standard for, again, the use of a CMP to present that, global privacy control as well as their other opt-out preferences.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing here is that, I think often brands will say, this is my data, right? And I guess the question is that I think a lot of the privacy laws, when you're sort of amalgamating data that's maybe not organically created inside of your own brand. But I think what I kind of grabbed with Sephora is that you can have a relationship with your own with your own users and brands, but if you're not hitting the bar as it relates to opt-in, opt-out, there's a higher level of rigor here as it relates to kind of how you're using that data. And if you're going to collect data and then arbitrarily sell that data or use that data without kind of disclosing that, that's going to be problematic, correct?
I think the sell part I think is pretty straightforward. We've got a couple of years to really understand what that is. This share part is where there's a lot of angst. And going back to your initial introduction around the ad tech industry, they should have a lot of angst around this issue. And particular in this conversation right now around the Attorney General versus the CPPA. I would be much less worried about the CPPA. I know a couple of the members of the CPPA board. They're reasonable people, really tenured track record of understanding the law. The Attorney General, I think, especially with the Sephora case, has proven that, he's a politician, right? He was just elected today. I think they announced publicly, like he won the race. And this Sephora thing was really a press release. Like, he looked for a brand that has global recognition or U.S. recognition, and if I'm a brand, I would be worried, about the relationships I have with all these ad tech companies and making sure that they really are repapered and that I really have the right disclosures in place, because the AG is really what to worry about, not the CPPA, at least for the foreseeable future. Because and the AG, as many people may know, had sent many letters. Like, they may not have enforced the law, but they had sent that letter campaign out and, required that 30-day cure period that was inherent in the CCPA in the past. It's getting shelved in the future, but allowing companies to make those changes and sending kind of a warning shot, I think, to all those companies. And again, I don't know Sephora's background, whether they got the warning shot and just didn't really, I guess they did get it and they didn't really respond that well. But that's what you just said a second ago, but like, it's still like that warning shot's going to go away and the AG is just going to start going after companies.
So the obvious thing here is as we move to increasingly towards this changing environment, what's your opinion as it relates to the types of data that people are going to use? I mean, I think a lot of people will say that if you're a data broker, that this is going to be increasingly difficult for you to operate. And I think you can argue that from different sides, whether or not, I mean, there's the first is like, can you operate as a data broker without kind of a connection to the consumer? That's one side of the equation. And then the other part is, if you are a brand like Sephora and you've got this heightened sense of awareness that there is potentially, whether it's an AG or it's another body, kind of looking for targets, are you not more calculated as it relates to the types of partners and data that you're actually using? Because I get the feeling that most Fortune 500 brands do not want to be featured in the journal, getting a letter from the AG that they're using a certain partner or certain data. Like, where's your head go on that?
Well, I mean, there's a few different things to unpack there, but I think, vendor risk management, and vendor being kind of an odd term right now, but any vendor risk management effort needs to be bolstered. I think that's crystal clear. And that is a requirement, again, in different state law as well, that you actually have a vendor risk management program in place. So, buttoning up those terms, but really also doing privacy impact assessments or risk impact assessments around what the vendor's actually doing, that's going to be critical moving forward. But there are a few new categories of data that I think are kind of a blind spot for a lot of companies. The biggest, I think, the employment data. And if you're a company, and it's very timely even today, you see like Facebook, Meta, announcing 11,000 layoffs, most of which I have to assume are Californians. And the biggest category of risk, I think, for companies that have large employee bases in California is former employees who know a lot and may be suing you or have disgruntled claims against you for laying them off or whatever happened, right? So these 11,000 Meta people, like come January 1st, they're going to have a whole new set of rights to go after Meta to say, hey, XYZ, give me my data, my employee data that, I think is going to be kind of a headache for any large California employer moving forward if they're not like really buttoned up around this.
Okay, I want to keep moving here, and for everybody that's put questions in, we're going to leave the questions to the end and then sort of try to burn them down. We at Reklaim, we often talk about companies that we refer to as being headless, and so our definition of a headless data company is a company that does not have a consumer face. And I guess one of the questions that we have is that with some of these changes to the rights where, the right to edit, the right for portability, the right to opt out, the right to not be included in modeling. Just to take an extreme example, if you are a headless data company operating in California with a profile on basically every California citizen and or every American, how do you remain compliant in that world?
When you say headless, I mean, you're really a data broker, essentially.
You could be a broker, but you could be a traditional kind of DMP, right? Like, so again, I mean, this industry historically has used a handful of partners as almost like an intermediary to move things around. But net is that you've got these huge companies operating in California that have profiles on Americans and California citizens, and there's no way for you as a citizen to communicate to those platforms, and those platforms are not communicating to you. And I guess the question is like, these are, a lot of them are public, a lot of them make a lot of money. And when I take Sephora and a PR hunting AG and a public company with lots of money, I'm like, that sounds like a bad cocktail, like waiting to happen. And I guess the question is like, can you remain compliant as a DMP in California with no UX?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I have to make the argument that that those kind of companies actually got off kind of easy with the CPRA and CCPA even. And again, certainly the data broker industry had to register with the state of California. Not that in fact, some of those registrations look like sales brochures, like if you go through them. So, again, the requirement falls not to those companies, right? It falls to their licensees of the data. So, big brand who licenses that data, they're on the hook. They have to disclose. They have to provide the opt-out. They have to, again, honor, deal with all these suppressions and all these kind of myriad of issues. But the licensor of the data, yeah, as you said, they're headless. Like there's no visibility other than maybe that California data broker registry, or maybe they're disclosed in some brands' privacy notices. Hey, we work with this company, and you want to opt out, go over there. But it's pretty minimal, their requirements other than just reposting their privacy policy in all the categories and anything that they already have. It's low-hanging fruit for them to make those updates and continue operating. It might, again, that friction we talked about with these are now included in the sale or share categories, like for DMPs, for example, potentially. Sure, yeah, those brands are going to have to take the burden of updating that they're using this DMP, but it doesn't mean the DMP has any new requirements there. It's pretty straightforward.
So let's if we're going to talk about DMPs, let's talk about the clean rooms, because clean rooms are very buzzy, and I think a lot of people are assuming that the clean room is going to save them in the future. Where does the clean room sort of sit in this new narrative, and what are people missing as it relates to implementing clean rooms and how that's solving for kind of what they believe that they're solving for?
Yeah, this is again, we could do the whole webinar just on this topic because I've got a lot of thoughts on this one. You have to define what is clean, because in my opinion, there are clean rooms and there are dirty clean rooms, and in this conversation, right, in this context. So, again, the clean piece of it is the foundational infrastructure that says that this isn't a DMP. This isn't a company that's going to host my data in a database somewhere and do this kind of merge, purge, and net down and all these things that, again, a DMP or some other data service company might have done in traditional, data management practices. This is a blind match synchronization from my company to a third party, to another company with this technology platform in the middle that actually doesn't touch the data. They just create keys essentially to say, hey, we can sync with each other and make some acknowledgement of each other's data at a very, very fundamental level. And so on the cleanness of the clean room side, again, that intermediary doesn't really do anything much other than create this kind of sync process. And for certain types of data, again, like you think about business development, like, hey, should we work together kind of thing? What's our overlap? Like, I'm just going to give you some generic match rate. And that match rate might even be used differential privacy to say it's fuzzy. Like there's a little bit of noise in that data that we're going to match, and it's not going to be exact. It's not going to be like 9.3% of our data actually matches. It'll be like, okay, 10% because we have a general sense of what that is. And so that clean room can be used to create that general sense at an aggregate number. That's crystal clean. Like that's beautiful. And that can be used in many different applications that don't have a problem. Where it gets a little dirty is in what we're seeing in audience targeting, right? And coming back to the CPRA changes and like, is that a share of data? And the clean room companies, I don't think have a great answer right now. Like, well, we're just doing the synchronization thing, and it's really just your data, and we're not really doing anything. Like we're not really in the middle here. We're not really a share. Like it's kind of an open question around that, right? And again, even if you're using differential privacy or other privacy enhancing technologies to try and fuzzy that data, if you're still at the end outputting an audience, and that audience is people you think are in that category of targeting, maybe your customers even, how is that not a share of data? Especially if it's, again, a behavioral audience that you're pulling to try and do addressable advertising to. So that's why I say it's a little dirty in the sense that we don't know for sure, like, are you really not a share of data if you're a clean room here doing that kind of intermediary work? And how do you paper up your contract to try and say, hey, we're just a platform here and you guys get to figure it out? There's ways to do that, I think. But again, the process itself, the share still takes place in that category. You can't get around it.
Right. there's way more on that, but I definitely want to hit on a couple of other topics here. The one other one topic that I think the media is all over is this notion of kind of the deprecation of the cookie. And I've been pounding the table on this for a while, saying that this is the most dangerous conversation in ad tech, is the fixation on the cookie, because what I believe is that there's almost this default reaction that the cookie is synonymous with privacy. And as the cookie gets delayed, so does privacy. And I think what we've sort of uncovered here is that there's a lot of stuff happening in privacy outside of the cookie. And I think even the notion of like the deprecation of the cookie is masking the larger initiative around the deprecation of addressability. And like we've seen, like the cookie hasn't deprecated yet, but we've seen massive issues as it relates to the introduction of ATT. Now we're seeing, flags around things like IP address, et cetera. Like, do you have any comments on sort of the narrative around the cookie, or sort of the miss from from the industry, that they're maybe not seeing the bigger issue, that there's a slow demise of addressability from some of these other identifiers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, we spent a lot of time on the cookie, but I think the area where I've spent a significant amount of time the last year and a half is around the Apple ATT. And again, and I think we've seen this in economics as well. Like, what Apple did was really a nuclear bomb to the mobile advertising ecosystem. And what, again, Facebook today laid off, or Meta laid off 11,000 people. There's a clear correlation there between what Apple did a year and a half ago and what Meta had to do today. And that's, because of, again, Apple called it privacy, but if you look at what Apple is saying, what is tracking and their definition, which is a proprietary definition of tracking, it is not IDFAs. We all think it's IDFAs, but it's everything. It's IP addresses, it's email addresses, it's phone numbers, it's names, it's anything that you're using for addressability. That is tracking. And
I think like where that's going is that it's almost that there's this distraction around everybody's. I mean, I think by and large, people have sort of accepted the fact that, ATT is having this impact, but and then they think, oh, the cookie's coming. But what they're not realizing is, like, we talked about this the other day, but if the IP address is actually banned, how does CTV continue to operate? So, like, how's that going to work? Like, if you get
I think it's sort of the elephant in the room around CTV, is that they have relied relatively exclusively on either the IP address or what may be considered a synthetic ID associated with the IP address, and that, in many ways that might be already violating ATT. And when Apple introduces their CTV advertising product any minute now, they may start enforcing against this with other CTV companies. So I think there's the IP address is not a proxy. Email address is not a proxy, at least under the ATT, without getting that consent. And again, what that consent looks like, I think, in Apple terms versus what is required under GDPR or other laws, I think it's still there's a little bit of a discrepancy there. And in my legal opinion, I think there actually is a conflict there, especially for GDPR, that Apple has done a disservice to the industry, and they should actually step aside and let the CMPs do that consent. But that's just my opinion. But it'll evolve still. Okay.
One other topic I wanted to get to, and then we can kind of turn the last few minutes over to some questions, is we're on the cookie, so let's stay on programmatic. I remember when we first launched the first version of Reklaim, it was literally on the first day of GDPR. Like, we kind of did it as a way to sort of stick a flag in the ground to say, this is the day that data is going to change, and it's going to have this ripple effect through the data. I'm not sure, because everybody is not necessarily paying attention to what's happening in Europe. I just think that I remember the narrative around GDPR saying, we saw some companies leave Europe, and then a lot of the narrative was, oh, well, we don't work in the EU, therefore it doesn't apply to us. And that law seems to me to have manifested in the form of CCPA and other privacy regulations around the world. It's almost acted as like this blueprint. And what I wonder is, what is happening with programmatic, specifically with the Belgian Data Protection Authority, and the EU as it relates to programmatic. Is this the same thing where, again, we'll talk specifically what they're fixated on, or I'll let you talk to that. But what I worry about here is there's a very, if this transpires, this is a massive impact on the industry. And I worry that there'll be people will be dismissive of it, like, oh, it doesn't matter because it's going to be in Europe. But historically, that has proven to not be the case, and that eventually manifests itself into North America. So can you maybe quickly talk to what the Belgian Data Protection Authority is sort of focusing on specifically as it relates to the biddable environment, and then we can debate kind of where it's going?
Yeah, I think on the European front, again, my personal opinion, I think the Belgians got it wrong that IAB is a joint controller, at least on that kind of narrow point. The question of whether RTB, really is meaningful consent is still, I think, up for debate. And ultimately, yeah, we're gonna, I think it's gonna be a year, but I think we're gonna see the dramatic changes to be required for TCF.
Just again, for the audience, I'll just read this and then you can comment on it. But during its investigation, the Belgian Data Protection Authority found that the transparency and consent framework used by ad brokers involved in real-time bidding does not comply with GDPR principles of transparency, fairness, accountability, and lawfulness of the processing. Between the inappropriate consent and insecure data transfer, and given the massive scale of data involved, real-time bidding was deemed, quote, the biggest data breach ever recorded, and it is repeated every day.
Yeah, that's the Johnny Ryan statement, almost verbatim used here. I think, yeah. So I think there's again, there's a lot to unpack there, but ultimately, I think that's the direction where the Europeans are going in, and there will have to be dramatic changes to the TCF program for it to continue, and RTB as a whole to continue in Europe. I do think the same thing might be coming to the US in the sense of this CPRA share issue. And again, the lack of transparency around RTB and how that works. And the same issue, Rob Bonta in particular could do the same thing that the Belgian DPAs just did, or CPPA could do the same thing and have a similar process that there isn't an effective opt-out. Now, again, the IAB is working really hard to shore that up with their multi-state privacy agreement, what used to be called the limited service provider agreement for CCPA. And so they've got a draft of it out right now. If you're in the ad tech industry, you should definitely look at it and work with the IAB to help shore it up. It's an insurance policy to help, against the Attorney General or CPPA coming after you on this regard. But again, it's similar to TCF. I mean, it's at least in the insurance policy sense of it, trying to protect the industry. I'm not sure it actually does. Like, we'll see. And it sort of depends on final regs, but I think you can't just say it's just Europe. It is going to happen here too.
Yeah, just process that for a second, because we've gone through having to rewrite contracts, deprecation of identifiers, loss of the notion of kind of being classified as a service provider, pressure on real-time bidding. Like, there's a ton of stuff going here. So, I think what I always kind of pound the table on is this is not about the cookie. Like, it's not the narrative is not about the cookie. There's a lot more kind of happening here. Just last thing before we turn it to questions is, you mentioned the IAB and kind of what they're trying to do to protect the programmatic industry. Like, you made reference to the fact that maybe they are, maybe it isn't protecting you. So if I'm a member of the IAB and I'm operating this space and I'm part of this, do you feel that that's enough protection, based on kind of where the industry is going, or it still needs a lot of work?
I think it's really important to point out you do not need to be a member of the IAB to sign on to the MSPA. They're going to allow the whole ecosystem to sign on to this compact, essentially, whether you're involved in the IAB or not. So again, please look at it if you're in the space, because it is your insurance policy, and I think it will be effective, at least for the short term, to help stave off regulation. And the IAB will work with Bonta or the CPPA to try and work this out if there's going to be enforcement.
Okay, cool. Let's take a look at sort of some of these questions. I don't want to dictate them to you, Ben, but if there's one or two here that kind of grab your attention, feel free to address these.
I see one about reaching across state lines, whether again the AG or Colorado AG, whether the AGs are going to work together or cross state lines. That's a really great question. And it's sort of a triggering one for me. And the author of that question may know that, because my opinion has been from day one from the CCPA that these laws in many ways are unconstitutional. And the notion that they can cross state lines, and again, maybe, not headless against the wrong term, but like, if I don't have nexus in California, I don't work there, I don't have a business there, like I'm not even clear I'm subject to the law, like, can they go after me? Are they discriminating against, individuals in other states? I think there's a lot to unpack there from a constitutional law question. Interstate Commerce Clause, Dormant Commerce Clause, like there's a lot there that I am surprised in the last couple of years hasn't come out yet. And no one is, again, there hasn't been enforcement. So as soon as the Attorney General, CPPA, really tries to enforce kind of one of these sort of narrow digital only points, I would love to see somebody challenge the law and get it up to the Supreme Court, for review. Because I think it would get cert. It could take years, but at least let's go there, because that is the argument for a federal law. And we really, as much as this is great business for me, don't want to be in this position to be navigating all these state laws around these kind of narrow, like, do not sell here, but it's okay to have an opt-out over there for targeted ads. Like, it's kind of confusing and mixed messages to the entirety of the United States. So unclear.
This other question I think is an interesting one, where the anonymous attendee, you don't need to hide, we're all friends here, but anyway, do the headless data companies have a responsibility to vet the prospective businesses interested in licensing their data to ensure their compliance?
No, they don't. They just have to have good contract terms. And that, unfortunately, that's why I say they kind of got off easy. Is all they have to do is update their privacy notices, update their contracts, and business as usual. And again, be a data broker if you're now a data broker, and register, in Vermont as well. But yeah, it's a strange irony that the CPRA, CCPA, and CPRA came from privacy advocates who maybe thought they were going after the data broker industry, but really did a pathetic job of going after data brokers, and changing their business models, because for the most part, it doesn't change.
I see. And then let's just do this last one from the agency scenario. When you have a do not sell or share my personal information, how will that work, especially if you don't know the identity of the individuals who make this request? Who does the work in the background?
That's a tough one. And I think this is where the clean rooms play a very clean role in and working with CMPs in particular to build out suppression data tools. And we saw this with the Can Spam Act, 19 years ago, which I was intimately involved with, which created this industry of suppression management tools, like Optismo is one that my clients have advocated for, where you have to share your email suppression list all over the industry without ever sharing it directly with the entity doing the emailing for you. And so we're going to see the same thing now with kind of the data broker industry, and I think with everybody in licensing and sharing, and having to build out these sort of robust preference management and suppression tools. But it's not going to be easy, and again, there's going to be a lot of gaps for a number of years here to figure out.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about that in the past. Like, will there be sort of this universal opt-out list that everybody sort of vends into, or a universal, do not sell list? I think one of the challenges in this industry is that a lot of these systems don't communicate. So, because it's always been consumer data out, and rather than, companies coming and getting the data directly from the consumer, we all know how impossible it is to sort of opt out, knowing that there's sort of this new legislation that requires, notification around do not sell. Like, can you have a universal do not sell signal that if me as a brand, or me as an agency, or me as a data company, I can actually simplistically plug into, so that I'm trying to remain compliant? I don't see how you can do that fractionally. Just, to me, it's just going to be a mess. And I can understand how a clean room can potentially support that. And I think that's sort of definitely a service that everybody can use.
Yeah, let me actually, I need to make one more point on this related topic that's super critical, which is that most advertisers share their loyalty file, like their active customers, as a suppression list for against third-party media, so they can do incremental media buying, right? Like, this is a common practice. That suppression list and that contract with the entity receiving it must be a service provider function. And this is where, again, like it's sort of hard to like wrap your head around, but I had to negotiate this. I work with a very large advertiser, and I've had to negotiate this and have these aha moments with all of these kind of intermediary ad tech companies and even media companies directly, where you're essentially saying two things. You know, one, you know, I might, you know, use your data and you're going to be a third party and it's okay, but I'm not selling you this data or sharing with you this data for you to suppress against. So I might sign a DPA with you, and in that DPA, I might have like, okay, for this data that I'm sharing, you're a service provider, absolutely, or a processor under GDPR, and you must be a processor or service provider because this is our loyalty data, this is our customers. We're not selling you this data, even if it's just, and your instructions are very specific, just suppress. That's all you're going to do. You do not get to control my data. You don't get to use my data for any other purpose or anything else. Just suppress. And so the papering of that language is really complicated, and it's going to get much more complicated, especially when you've got your California service provider, you've got your Virginia processor language, you've got like, it's just going to get messy.
Lots here. So, okay, let's let everybody go. But before we go, just if people want to reach out to you or want to retain you for your intimate knowledge and expertise, why not, right? Where can they find you, or where can they reach out to you?
Well, I mean, certainly LinkedIn, but my website's inhouseprivacy.com, or just Ben at inhouseprivacy.com is my email.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, if you're looking to get in touch with me, you can reach me at Neil at Reclaim Yours, or via the various different social platforms as well. Thanks everybody for participating in this hour-long topic on privacy. As you can see, like there's a lot here, a lot more than just this notion of fixation on cookie. Thanks for everybody for giving up an hour of your day. This will be sitting on our website. So if you didn't get a chance to kind of finish it, or you want to go back and refer to some of these great thoughts that Ben's had, feel free. We will send out a note. What I'll also do is I'll put in the links to the IAB stuff too, just so that people have that as a reference point as well. But thanks again, everybody, for your time, and look for the next installment of the Reklaim webinar series in the coming month. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Neil.
Okay,
thanks,
bye-bye.
everyone.